Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to give folks just a few moments to enter the event and then get us started. As you're joining the event, we would love for you to put in the chat box where you're calling in from. We love to see the full diaspora in our audience. And we're really thrilled to be able to reach so many people with these events. Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Looks like we have folks calling in from all over. First of all, my name is Nia McCallister and I am the Public Programs Manager at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. MoAD is a contemporary art museum and our exhibitions and programming inspire learning through the global lens of the African diaspora. As we gather here today, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the times we're living in and the current circumstances that we're navigating. MoAD stands in solidarity with Black Lives Matter as there are multiple pandemics killing us, including the ongoing systemic violence against Black people. We honor and mourn the senseless murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Casey Goodson Jr., Patrick Warren Sr., Andre Hill, and so many others who have lost their lives from police brutality and racial injustice, including those whose names we do not know. We want to acknowledge that as this list of names continues to grow, we will continue to say them and continue to bring awareness in the fight for justice for the global Black community. I also want to acknowledge the spaces that we're occupying. Though we're gathering virtually, many of us are settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcibly brought to this continent, and our institutions were founded upon the exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples whose lands we're located on. It is with deep respect that MoAD acknowledges that even in virtual space, we reside on unceded native lands and thank the indigenous peoples of the Bay Area and beyond who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Now today, MoAD is thrilled to be partnering with Litquake to present this conversation between Jess Cole and Georgina Lawton for the launch of Lawton's new book, RACELESS, In Search of Family, Identity, and the Truth About Where I Belong. Litquake is also launching its spring schedule with today's program, so I encourage you to check out what they have coming up at litquake.org. We also have copies of RACELESS available for purchase at the MoAD bookstore, and we'll be putting information about that in the chat. So to start this event, I will be introducing Jess, who will then introduce Georgina. And we encourage everyone throughout this event to participate by making comments in the chat and also submitting questions to the Q&A. At the end of the conversation, we'll have time for you to share those questions with the audience. So first of all, I'm thrilled to introduce Jess Cole. Originally from Devon in southwest of England, Jess Cole is a model and writer residing in Southeast London. Jess was one of the original contributors for the UK's Galdem magazine and has since gone on to write for publications such as The Guardian, The New York Times, ID, and Vogue. One of the primary focuses of her journalism has been to broaden the narratives of diversity by exploring the varieties of Blackness and class politics within the public sphere. In addition to this, she has recently collaborated on the staging of 2 plays and is currently experimenting with script writing and poetry. Please join me in welcoming Jess Cole and Georgina Lawton.
Hi, I'm very excited to introduce Georgina Lawton, who is a journalist, speaker, and writer currently based in London. Georgina has previously been a columnist for The Guardian, where she continues to freelance alongside publications such as The Independent, Galdem, and Stylist. Georgina is also a broadcaster and host of the Audible podcast, Secrets in Us, and is the author of RACELESS, which launches today in the US and is the reason why we're all here today. So RACELESS is rooted in Georgina's experience of growing up as a mixed race child with 2 white parents and an all white family in the very normal white suburb of Sutton. Any discussion of race or of her difference brought up would be ushered away by her family into the cover story that her darker complexion was because of a throwback gene. She was not black, she was theirs, and she was white. Eventually, Georgina discovered that she was actually the product of an affair her mother had had with a black man in Shepherd's Bush. It's from this discovery that Georgina then widens the topic of her own identity into an exploration of blackness across different black communities, mixed race identity, and the psychological impact of being misidentified. I was personally really captivated by this book because for the first time, I didn't feel so isolated in my mixed heritage. There are parallels in our upbringing. I'm from a rural white working class family where race was never really discussed, and I used to innocently refer to myself as being half caste. It wasn't until I moved to London that I slowly started to discover and embrace my blackness. So I'm thrilled, Georgina, to be speaking with you today, as I feel that this book is a very needed exploration of what constitutes our sense of self and the nuances of identity. So how are you, Georgina? You good?
Yeah, good, thank you. Happy to be here.
Good. Yeah.
Listening to the introduction, and it's nice to hear feedback on the book, so it's always welcome.
Yay. So when did you start to think that your experiences might become a book?
I would say when I started to write about identity and race online, so back in 2017, when I started writing in The Guardian, I got an overwhelming response from people around the world. And the messages that stood out were the ones where people said, oh, the same things happened to me, or I took a DNA test last year and I worked out that, you know, who I thought I was isn't the case. So then I started to sort of, you know, become a bit more emboldened and a bit braver with my writing, because I was like, okay, it's not just this weird story of this kind of like racial silence in this tiny part of suburban London. It's actually a global experience that no one's really talking about, because there's a lot of shame around these stories and there's a lot of embarrassment. And it's not just our story, it's our parents' story as well. And in sort of shedding that silence, you're disrupting family narratives and you're upsetting people. So there's a lot of people who tried to share their stories and I wanted to interview them for the book, and then they backed out and they said, oh, actually, no, you know, I'm not brave enough to confront my dad yet, or I'm not brave enough to talk to my family. So all of these experiences were unfolding in my inbox, and it was really exciting and, you know, really sad as well to see my experiences mirrored in others around the world. But it also, yeah, definitely gave me permission to carry on writing and to think to myself, okay, this could be a book not just about me, but about other people as well. So yeah, that's what I did. And I made it into a book in 2019. I started writing it and then sort of did it quite quickly in 6 months. But there was a lot of stuff that was pushed back because of Corona and, you know, the pandemic and everything else going on. So yeah, it's finally out now, out today in the US, which is really exciting, out last week in the UK. And yeah, it's been like my whole life in the making, I guess. One of those books that's like, you know, been sort of brewing for many years.
Yeah, it's incredible. I think the thing that I really loved about your style of writing is that it's kind of non-linear narrative, and that you kind of go from the past into the present, and then it's no but the way it's structured is just so beautiful, and it kind of reminded me of like the journey of the self is so refracted and it's not linear. I was just wondering if you could explain a bit about like how you did that, because it was amazing.
So yeah, shout out to my editor Sarah Reed at Harper and my other editor in the UK. They worked together with me on the structure because, you know, when you're writing a memoir, there is a lot of reflection in that, but also I didn't want it to be just a straight like I grew up and then this happened and then this happened. I wanted it to sort of flick back and forth between present and sort of the journey that I was on. So just to give people a bit of background, the journey sort of really starts when I take DNA tests and I figure out that, you know, the dad that raised me, who I love very much, wasn't my biological dad, and that meant that I had heritage and, you know, biology, parentage from somewhere else. And then I go on this journey and I travel to like Black majority countries in sort of search for myself. And then I come back and I start working out things with my mum and going to therapy and reflecting on my childhood. So there's a lot of reflection in that, but there's sort of one narrative arc where I'm on this like, you know, physical journey, but also, I guess, an emotional one as well, very much so. And it was hard to piece all of that together because there was a lot going on in my head. And then on top of that, I also had interviews from other people where, you know, that I wanted to insert in the book. And I also had, studies and research. So to put all that together in a structure that works, in a form that works, that was like both personal, but also a little bit academic, that I enjoyed blending the genres together, but the structure was definitely something that was a bit challenging. So yeah, my editors, I can't take all the credit for that. My editors helped me a little bit with that one.
Oh, you did a great job. I love it. So do you want to read a piece from the book?
Yeah, so this will sort of set the tone for how I grew up, and then it sort of leads into an interesting study that I explained as well. So this is from the chapter called Wearing Someone Else's Face, which is chapter 4. At the heart of my life on the humdrum borders between Surrey and London was my parents' love, which kept me cushioned from the reality of dealing with our differences. Their support system enabled my protective context to remain intact and ensured that everything stayed the same. For 18 years, I walked the same pavements back and forth, past the same red-roofed 1930s houses, crossed the same quiet roads, and had many of the same friends, all of whom accepted me and my story without question. Naysayers will declare me crazy. Debates have raged in many an online comment section on why I simply didn't just look in the mirror or go to the eye doctor to realize I am Black. But their time would be better spent reflecting on the smallness of their own childhood worlds, the control over which rested with their parents, and acknowledging how all of us are totally psychologically susceptible to our caregivers' teachings. As children, our world is limited. The parameters of life barely extend beyond school, home, the houses of our friends, and the odd extracurricular class. I'm grateful for the steady continuity that was maintained in my life during my early childhood, but I also recognize now how this inadvertently contributed to the erasure of my racial identity. The dull roar in the background, reminding me that things were off kilter, slowly became a persistent buzz at the back of my brain when I was a teenager, and later after I moved away to university, it became a deafening scream that I could no longer ignore. A fascinating study suggests there are real-life health implications when you are misidentified. A study on healthcare outcomes and race carried out by the University of British Columbia found that participants who reported higher incidences of racial identity mismatching were more likely to suffer with poor general health. People who considered themselves to be white but believed others tend to think that they are something else, perhaps they are of mixed race heritage, are at a higher risk of high blood pressure and poor mental health, one of the researchers noted. Being perceived in a way that does not match with our own internal view of ourselves is a trauma that is deep enough to leave emotional and physical impacts on the body that can negatively alter our health outcomes. I feel this acutely when I look back on the abuse I inflicted on my own body. That's chapter 4, section of chapter 4 there.
That was great, Georgina. Thank you. Wow. Sorry, it just resonates with me so much. And what was your internal, like, how did you feel internally compared to like your exterior?
So I always reiterate to people that I did have a really, happy childhood with a lot of love from 2 parents that were really hands-on and generally good relationships with my cousins. My mum's from Ireland and I was close with my Irish cousins, and, my dad's family as well have always accepted me without question. But it was just this sort of like constant internal angst around not knowing why I looked different. And as a child, you can sort of, suppress that because you're concerned with other things. But as you get older and you become more cynical and more people ask you to qualify your appearance, especially in relation to all the people around you in your life that don't look like you, it just became a lot more difficult to, uphold this family narrative. And I don't think my family realized how much it was sort of impacting me and how much I had to carry on my own. I was constantly defending my mum and her fidelity to strangers who would say, oh, your mum's obviously lying, you've obviously got a different dad. And I'd always defend my family narrative because that's what I was encouraged to do. But doing that for years on my own with no help or support from anyone was like really tough. And yeah, I think it then started to manifest itself in how I presented as a teenager. I was at war with my hair, and that's not to say my parents didn't look after it, like it was always done, but it wasn't sort of done to the standards that, you know, other Black people would say your hair is done, like it wasn't braided, and we didn't have the products that I use now. But my mum did take me to some good salons to you know, get it sorted in South London when I was about 10 or 11, but we never had those conversations about why we were leaving our white area to go to, you know, a Black salon on the other side of the city. We never had those conversations about why. And I think just that level of silence and the power of silence in families, when one person has to carry that on their own, it can be really detrimental to that person's mental health, but it also keeps people more separate from each other than they needed to be.
Yeah.
So if I was able to have these conversations with my parents from a young age, I would have learned to accept it. And I think we probably would have been closer earlier on, because, you know, we would have understood each other a bit more, and I would have understood more about their decisions and their choices, and I would have accepted it, and I wouldn't have had to work everything out on my own. So it was definitely tough at times. And of course, like as kids, we all want to know what our origin story is. And as teenagers, you know, we're dying to have that story so we can fit in and we can tell other people where we're from and who we are. And just not having that was definitely tough. And I think it made me a lot more defensive than I needed to be, because I was so scared of somebody making a comment that I often wanted to like beat them to the punch. And just writing about it has just freed me from that whole part of my personality that isn't really there anymore, because I just feel so much lighter as a result of naming, you know, what I am and what has gone on.
Yeah, it's cathartic, isn't it? It's just to get it out there. And I think also, because we're like a similar age, it was like when we were growing up in the UK, there wasn't, even on TV or in the magazines, there wasn't particularly any really reference points if you're a mixed race, let alone a black woman, right? And like with the hairstyles and stuff, like it really resonated with me. So I remember when I was going to hairdressers, I'd always pick out really straight haircuts and ask them to make me look like that person, and obviously it would never work. So I was like, it's kind of curly, it will kind of work like that. And I thought it was really interesting how
so much. Sorry, go on.
No, what were you saying?
I was just saying I straightened my hair so much, I really frazzled it, you know, ruined it trying to make it look like my mum's hair and all the hair of my friends, and it just, you know, it doesn't work.
Especially when you're emo as well, right?
Yes.
The emo face.
Emo phase. But of course, like being an emo, I put in the book, it necessitates a certain look, like really skinny legs and really straight hair. And those are just two things that I don't have. So it was like trying to force a square peg into a round hole. But I love my emo phase, but I don't love the pictures of how I used to look back in the day with this horrible like lock fringe that just would never straighten.
It's progression, babe. It's progression.
Yeah.
So I thought it was really interesting as well when you said that you recently found out that Pete Wentz from Fall Out Boy was of Jamaican heritage, and that you actually felt like if we'd known that as like younger, when we were younger, perhaps you'd have felt more kind of embraced by the emo scene, right?
Yeah, because the emo scene is like incredibly white. So when I found out Pete Wentz was Jamaican, I was like, what? Like the emo scene, everybody I can think of really was white in that era. So interesting that we didn't know that growing up, that he's actually of Jamaican heritage. That's Fall Out Boy for anyone that wants to know the band that we're talking about.
Which I guess like brings me on to that, if you could talk a bit more about what racial mirroring is. So I feel like that's so important, right?
Yeah, it is important. And when I started writing about my upbringing, and I was looking at lots of studies and, you know, talking to therapists who told me that some of my experiences were really similar to transracial adoptees, so people who've been adopted by white parents like me. But obviously I'm not adopted, but we had lots of similar kind of points of reference. So I was looking at all these studies around, what it's like to grow up in a household where no one looks like you, basically. And I found out that a racial mirror is really important just for your sense of self. And that is, you know, someone that looks like you, who is doing well, maybe in life or in a particular field. And that helps you locate yourself in the wider narrative of, you know, the world. And of course, I didn't have a racial mirror growing up. I didn't have anyone around me that looked like me. But as a small child, I don't think I was really looking, because I was encouraged not to talk about my difference and not to talk about identity. So I just absorbed what my parents gave me. So I read a lot, but I don't remember reading or wanting to read books by Black authors. I don't remember seeking out a racial mirror or feeling like you know, even super conscious that no one looked like me. As I got older, that definitely started to cross my mind. But as a young child, I really wasn't looking for that, because it's just something that wasn't on my radar. And I didn't have the tools to work out what race meant. Even though I could see I was different, I wasn't craving kind of recognition until I got a bit older. Saying that though, I do tell people that my first ever album was Shaggy, Hot Shot. And that came out when I was 5. And I wonder why I was drawn to that album of this black man singing this really great, catchy pop music. And yeah, that was my first ever album, Shaggy.
That's a great album. Would
Yeah.
you say it's kind of when you were growing up then that you, any kind of like black culture you rejected, and that you kind of were always going for sort of more white culture? Or
I didn't have access to it. Like, people ask me this, and I like, my dad played a lot of like black music. Like, he played the Specials, he'd play Bob Marley, he was a punk back in the 80s. And, you know, I'd listen to the Toots and the Maytals, and he definitely appreciated music from all over the world. And he liked a lot of reggae and ska. And I listened to that and I love that music. And maybe that really was, you know, the first reference point for me in working out where I figured, working out where I was situated in the world. Because like I said, I was listening to that music and I was drawn towards this album by Shaggy, but we never spoke about what it meant. And we never spoke about, oh, Dad, you're listening to music by this band and the singer looks like me. Like, I never really had those conversations with my parents. So the cultural identity that was bestowed upon me was very much British and Irish, because my mum is Irish. And then sort of little by little, I've worked on, you know, building up the other cultural reference points, which situate me in, like, you know, an African diaspora, which situate me in this whole vibrant community of people around the world. But that was really a sort of psychological adjustment. When I got the DNA test results, I really gave myself permission to start exploring that side of me, because my race has always been there. Like, I've always been a mixed black woman. I've always been part of this diasporic community, but I never gave myself the permission to seek things out and to, you know, explore the cultural reference points that are very kind of natural to a lot of people, like getting my hair braided and stuff. I was so scared to do that as a young woman, because I thought it would mark me as more of an outsider in my white community. So even stuff like that. But I was very conscious of not sort of, you know, following this paint by numbers guide to being black. Like, it wasn't like, you know, read a book and then you become black. It was very much like a gradual psychological adjustment, whereby I had to really see myself as what I am, and then read widely and listen to music and live in spaces where I could see my reflection, you know, mirrored back to me, and find those racial mirrors. So living abroad in black communities was definitely really useful. And I went and did that, you know, after the DNA test results, and just sort of gradually adjusted my mindset. It wasn't sort of like flick a switch and suddenly like, wow, I'm black. It wasn't like that. It was more of a gradual thing. And yeah, I always say to people, my race has always been there. It's just not something that as a small child I could work out on my own.
Yeah, I agree with you. I also think that like there's, blackness has nuance to it, right? There's not one thing that constitutes like that's black and that's white. Like, it's like, it just says such an interesting thing about like identity as well. It's like, it's not a fixed thing. It can be anything at the same time, right? Just because you're black doesn't mean you have to like this and this, and that's like your blackness. I think it's great.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really reductive, and it really does us all a disservice when we, you know, say to someone that you're not really black because you listen to emo music, or you're not really black because you know, you haven't done your hair a certain way. Like, it's not for anybody to decide how and when we assert our blackness. Like, that's it's not a weapon, and it's not something that somebody else should sort of dictate to us in any way. And I also think, yeah, when we're in interesting times now where, you know, we're sort of leaning towards old, nearly eugenicist style thinking, where we're saying, you know, there are biological components that make somebody black, and to be black, you've got to have, you know, this heritage or look like this. And it's a really interesting time, but it's a little bit dangerous as well, because I feel like some of those conversations can be quite reductive. And of course, there is no binary metric system which determines who is Black and who is white. Like, these categories are constructs, and of course they have serious consequences for all of us in our lives, but they are constructs that shouldn't even exist in the first place. So I think we all need to remember that as we as we talk about race, and, you know, talk about who gets to claim what sort of identity.
Definitely, I definitely agree with you. I also think that as like, it's great that diversity and representation is becoming more and more and more, but I think with that, it's become this thing that everything has to make complete sense to everyone has to understand everything perfectly, and there's no like space for like complexities and like this like idea of like opacity, where it's just stuff, just accepting difference even if you don't understand it. And I think as we're moving into this very diverse culture and media, we're kind of losing that ability to just accept someone and not completely understand them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Does that
no,
make sense?
absolutely. There's no nuance at the minute when you're on Twitter and you're reading these threads about, you know, mixed identity or biracial identity. There's no nuance when we're talking about the term white passing. Like, I keep seeing all this stuff online now, you know, if you're white passing, you're just white. And it's really not that simple. Like, there's people who have got Black parents that wouldn't consider themselves white, but they're extremely light. And I think it's really dangerous to start, you know, determining how other people should identify when they've got, you know, cultural proof and heritage as proof as well. I think it's really, yeah, it can be quite harmful. So nuance is key. Nuance is the word of 2021. We need more nuance.
And could you explain what the difference is between, because I thought it was really interesting in the book, you actually, because I didn't know that there was a difference between race and ethnicity. And could you just like explain what that difference is and how those terms?
So we, as a society, we do misuse the term ethnicity. And in the UK, you know, we're asked to fill out these forms that determine what our ethnic background is. And often it will say something like white, Black, Asian, but that's not an ethnicity. That's more kind of a racial category. So an ethnicity is something that is not fixed, it's very movable, and it's determined by community, traditions, culture. So, you know, ethnically I could be white British, but that will, you know, alarm people if I say that out loud, but all that means is I've got a white cultural identity, I guess, or I did when I was growing up. But we kind of misuse the word ethnicity and we conflate it for the term race. And obviously race, as I said, doesn't have any biological significance in terms of science or our DNA. Of course, there are phenotypical differences, which are things like skin color and eye shape and hair, but they're not coded into our DNA. So there's no biological basis for the term race, but race, we think of it as being kind of like something that's embedded in our biology. But when we take these DNA tests and when we fill out these forms and it says, what's your ethnicity? They often confuse it for the word race. And I don't know why that is. I think it's just been misused now for a long, long time. But yeah, ethnicity can change. Like, you can have a different ethnicity depending on sort of, I guess, how you're raised. And ethnically, yeah, my cultural identity growing up was white, British and Irish. Yeah.
And you talk a lot about travel. This is your favorite. And you went in the book, you talk about going to New York, Nicaragua, Cuba, the Dominican Republic and Vietnam, but you also went by yourself. So how was that experience of going as a solo female traveler, which I completely love doing that. I think it's the best thing, but people get scared about doing it, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I understand why people get scared, because, you know, the unknown can be scary, but I think it's so enriching and you learn so much about yourself and you learn how to depend on yourself, and you just get a lot of stuff done as well when you're on your own. You don't have to worry about anyone else's schedule. So I loved it for all those reasons, and it's made me incredibly independent, and, you know, I just take off at the drop of a hat nowadays. And I'm in Lisbon at the minute just working because I sort of crave that sort of excitement, and what living abroad kind of gives me that. So yeah, I left the UK in 2016 after I got my DNA test results, and it was sort of to give me and my mum space to breathe and space to accept what had happened. And I was also grieving the loss of my dad and the loss of the relationship that I thought we had. So it was really difficult, but I knew that I didn't want to sort of sit at home and wallow. I needed to kind of transport myself somewhere else and move forward with parts of my life, and also reclaim aspects of my identity that I didn't know how to kind of give myself growing up. So I went to mainly Black myself to indulge in those parts of my identity that I didn't. Oh, is my connection okay?
Yeah, that was me. That just went out as well. I was like, no.
That's your fault. That's not our fault. So that's fine.
No. And you went to Cuba as well, right?
Yes, went to Cuba for a month.
How did you find that?
Yeah, there's no like real internet there, so that was a lot of hustling, and a lot of kind of trying to make myself known, speaking Spanish, make myself understood rather, speaking Spanish. And I write a lot in the book about this kind of notion of passing, and in like American literature, passing is, you know, very much explored because it's more of an American tradition where you pass, if you're light-skinned, pass as white and pass as black, and sort of cross between the two lives. And I think it's really interesting now, as the world is smaller. Well, it was smaller before the pandemic, but it was smaller in the way that we can travel and go anywhere. And I think as somebody who can pass as a local in these black spaces, it was really interesting to speak Spanish and, you know, hitchhike in Cuba and Nicaragua and all these amazing countries, and be mistaken for a local, be mistaken for somebody that can blend in, you know, ethnically. People thought I was Dominican, my culture was Dominican or Cuban, but then have to assert yourself and speak English really loudly when something bad is about to happen, or, you know, just hold up your hands and say, oh, sorry, I'm a tourist, I didn't know, when you're kind of like in a space that you shouldn't be. Or I remember I was pulled over once when I was hitchhiking by the police in Cuba, and I didn't know that as a tourist you're not supposed to hitchhike, but the person that picked me up knew, because he knew that I wasn't Cuban, but because I could pass as a Cuban, he just thought, oh, I'll risk it and I'll put her in the back. And then we got pulled over by the police, and I didn't know what was going on, but as soon as I started speaking English, they were like, oh, it's fine, she's a tourist, like she can go. So I write a lot about the power of passing, and passport privilege as well, you know, being a Black person that can blend into these countries, but then has the privilege of asserting themselves when they speak English or when they show their British or American passport. I think that's a really interesting concept that a lot of people also experience when they're second or third generation, you know, Caribbean or African, and they go home and they look like everybody else, but they feel like sort of a cultural imposter because they haven't been home in so many years. So it's a really interesting thing. And I think a lot of people in the diasporic community experience that. And I'm really enjoying reading other people's experiences on that phenomenon as well.
It's also just that kind of brings up that idea of how kind of ridiculous borders are, right? That the fact that just because you've got this passport, you it kind of defines where you can go, what you can do, how you're treated at the airport. And I think the pandemic's been a really interesting thing, that COVID, that there are no borders. It will affect everyone. And like, I don't know.
Exactly. And passports that were once really powerful, like British and American passports, you know, like now we're blacklisted by other parts of the world, like Australia and parts of Asia, because, you know, our COVID is out of control. And years ago, our passport was the one that everybody was trying to get. And now I think, you know, it's really switched things on its head. We've inverted that whole concept of passport privilege, and it's no longer as much of a privilege to be, you know, from the US or the UK because of our situation with the pandemic. So it's really interesting to see it change, and also situate yourself in that as a Black traveller with a once powerful passport. It's really interesting.
Yeah, no, it's like, who would have thought that everyone would be scrambling to get their Irish passports now?
Yes, I still need to get mine.
So do I.
It's better than the British one, right? Like, it's going to be far more powerful than the UK passport, that's for sure.
Yeah. And you spoke also about how when you went to Cuba, the Cubans were saying, kind of referring to it as a racial utopia. Could you explain a bit more about that as well? Was that the case?
Yeah, so when I was in Cuba, I was amazed at how many, you know, mixed families I saw, people of all different hues, far more blended than the UK even, and we are pretty mixed as a nation now. So I remember talking to the Cubans and being like, wow, is race really, you know, it doesn't seem to be as big a factor in your society. And they would all tell me, yeah, it's not a big deal. Castro has created this meritocracy, and on the surface it definitely looked true, but then when I went and I started researching racial disparities in Cuba, and I put this in the book, there was like, you know, a lot of research into who owns the property and who owns who has bank accounts in that country, and it's actually all the white Cubans. They're overwhelmingly richer than the darker skinned Cubans. You know, Cubans of European descent are more likely to have a bank account, they're more likely to own more than one property. But on the surface, it does feel like a racial utopia in a way. And I think that's definitely the legacy of Castro, from what I've read and what I've spoken to Cubans about, because he did try and, yeah, create this communist utopia in which race wasn't a factor. And I think to a certain degree, he might have succeeded, but when you look and you go back to Cuba's history, like, they had mass sugar plantations, like slavery was rife there. And of course, the scars of that, you know, reverberate over generations. We've got hundreds of years between then and now, but we still see all over the world why Black communities are always more disenfranchised. And it's because of that legacy of slavery that's going to take, you know, hundreds of years to readjust. And I think people forget just how recent it was in a way. And I think the Cubans they're so warm, they're so amazing. And, you know, I don't want to talk about their country because they all obviously know more than me, but they weren't having those conversations about, you know, the reality of the racially hierarchical society that they lived in, which was just the same as other parts of the Caribbean, just the same as the UK, just the same as the States. And it's all because of slavery and colonialism, basically.
Yeah, that's true. And you also went to the DR afterwards, right?
Yeah, went to the Dominican Republic, loved that.
So how was your experience of the Dominican Republic, and how did you look after your hair in the Dominican Republic?
Hair was such a big thing there. Like, you know, I blended in more in the DR than I think any other space that I went to, and I made some really great friends. But one of the first friends I met was in the supermarket when I was asking her, you know, how do you get curly hair products here? Because she was also curly haired, and she just switched to English, and she was like, oh, we don't have a lot of curly hair products because everyone's still straightening their hair. And this was like 5 or 6 years ago. And I think there's definitely more work that's been done on, you know, the natural hair movement. But I realized that, you know, in the UK, we've got colorism that really manifests itself in features and skin tone and hair as well. But in the Dominican Republic, I really felt like hair was that marker of kind of beauty, and everyone was sort of aspiring to have straight hair or hair that didn't resemble, you know, an afro, and even curly hair was really kind of frowned upon by some people. And I remember walking around in the streets and I kept getting comments about my hair, like people would shout, you should braid it, or, you know, in Spanish, and I'd go home and I'd be like, did that girl say something really nasty? But it was 2 hours later, because my Spanish was not that good, it would just sink into my head and I'd be like, I've just been dragged, but I didn't have the language to respond because my Spanish was not good enough. But yeah, it was just interesting to see, you know, the pernicious effects of the beauty standards that have started in Western Europe and that we've exported all over the Caribbean. And in the Dominican Republic, it really manifested itself in colorism around the ideals of hair and what good hair was and what bad hair was. And to have good hair, I think a lot of the time is to have hair that's closer to the European aesthetic. And I really felt that when I was walking around and I couldn't find my products and I was getting shouted at and I was like, what is going on? So yeah, it was interesting to compare, you know, how we treat those features in the DR and why the DR is like that. And it's of course because of those standards that have come from the UK and Spain and all these other former colonial superpowers.
It's also that anti-Haitianness as well, right? That was with the Dominican Republic, and that Haiti is actually on the same island as the Dominican Republic.
Yeah, I didn't know that till I arrived. So I learned a lot about, again, sort of diasporic relations and the history of those two countries. I found really interesting, and you know, the legacy of Trujillo, the dictator, on the Dominican Republic. So yeah, all of these parts of my travels, it was really great to sort of situate myself in this history.
Yeah.
But it was also alarming as well, because I thought that all these beautifully vibrant Black spaces would be free of the kind of beauty standards that we had back home, but it was very similar. It was just slightly different.
And then you also went to Vietnam and kind of went right to the source of where a lot of hair is actually supplied, right, for weaves. And I was just wondering if you could tell me a bit about your discoveries there of that.
Yeah, so I went to Vietnam on a press trip from New York when I was living there. And, the press trip was really fun, but I really wanted to write a story beyond sort of the nice boat trips and the really great food. So I contacted a hair factory. And I didn't know if this story was ever going to get published, but I contacted a hair factory and I was like, listen, I'm going to write a story about Black hair. I want to sort of trace the journey from, the roots of Vietnamese women to the heads of women like me, because of course I've been wearing weaves and I'd been straightening my hair just a few years prior to that. So I really wanted to find out, where does this hair actually come from? And I met these two brothers who, told me their names were like Jack and Tom, but of course, like, it wasn't. They had Vietnamese names and they were from Vietnam, and they took me to their factory, and it was like a whole 10-hour day. I just hopped in their car and I could have been taken anywhere, but luckily they took me to their factory and they showed me where they get their hair from, and they took me to the women who provide the hair. They told me that, they pay them really well, but I later found out that, you could sell a whole head of hair and you could get paid like $5-10 for a whole ponytail. So it was really interesting to see, and it was interesting to view that experience. And I actually watched a woman get her hair chopped in front of me, and then they put it in this big bundle of ponytails in the corner of the room, and there were women like washing them, and then they take them to the factory and then they dye them and they pick the lice out of them. And it's
Do you think these women actually wanted to sell their hair? It's because of the kind of, that was their only option, was to survive, was to sell their hair?
Yeah, like the guys who own the factory would tell me that these women wanted to sell their hair and it was too hot in Vietnam and they just wanted to sort of, have short hair. But when I looked around at all the women in that country, everyone had long hair, sort of down to their bums. You can kind of see that it's definitely this marker of beauty in Vietnam, as it is in so many countries around the world, like long flowing locks. It's the same standard everywhere. So I didn't really believe everything that they told me, but it was super interesting to see that, even though I felt like a bit of a voyeur, because I felt like they orchestrated these haircuts for me because they knew I was coming, and it was a bit awkward because I was like, am I participating in this? Even though I'm not buying hair extensions anymore, I'm sort of, watching these women get their hair cut in front of me for my article. Like, it was really bizarre.
So I guess it just kind of speaks of the pressures of femininity experienced by pretty much all races of women, right? Because it's just that these Vietnamese women they've had to cut their hair off, which is a symbol of femininity, which is then sold to Black women in the UK who want to, or feel that they need to have the long sleek hair for the weaves. It's just this constant, and also how hair is so integral to to women, right? Like if a woman shaves her head off, it's still seen as quite a controversial thing. And I think it was just so fascinating that you located like kind of where some of this hair comes from, and that perhaps it's not from a particularly warm place as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you can see within this like capitalist framework that it's always the women that are suffering the most. It's always women that are being asked to perform the standards of beauty and sort of adhere to these Eurocentric norms around long flowing hair. Whatever part of the world we're in, like, we're seeing that is still something that all women should aspire to. And we're penalized for not adhering to these standards. So you can see just that sort of journey from one woman's sort of need to survive to another's.
No, definitely. Well, Georgina, it's been lovely to talk to you. I think we're gonna pass over for some Q&As.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, it's gone so quick, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has.
Thank you both for this conversation. It's been just so relevant and interesting to hear just the parallels and how many topics that this book touches upon. So we do have a few questions that have been coming in, and a lot of affirmations from the audience as well. But I would like to start with one from Sarah Laripo Manika, who says, this has been such a wonderful conversation and she thanks you, and she would love to hear about any Black British authors or artists who have inspired you in your writing journey.
Yeah, Black and British. I guess Zadie Smith very recently. I've been reading Swing Time, which follows, the story of two mixed race British girls. And, I've really fallen in love with Zadie Smith writing through that. I read some of her other stuff, but this book really spoke to me. So Zadie Smith for sure. And she's not British, but Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, fiction-wise, Americana, Half a Yellow Sun. It was amazing to sort of see that, I guess, transnational aspect to another woman's work, looking at sort of being caught in cultural crossfires. That's something that really spoke to me, and I love fiction. That's what I'm working on now. So fiction-wise, I'd say those two, and then Black British, I guess, like non-fiction wise, like Stuart Hall, the Black British theorist. Was reading a lot of his work, and people like Emma Dabiri, Afua Hirsch, they've written non-fiction books around race. Emma's one was on hair and looking at sort of capitalism and the power of colonialism in Africa, and the significance of black hair. That was really great. I learned so much from that. And Afua Hirsch is British, which is another non-fiction, which is part memoir, part analysis. So yeah, all of those were really influential on me when I was writing RACELESS.
Great, thank you. Definitely some of my favorite books in there as well.
Yeah.
We have another question from Jan S, who asks, how is your relationship now with your parents, and have you had the opportunity to meet your biological father?
Yeah, no, I haven't had that opportunity. Obviously taking a DNA test and finding a distant Black relative was really great, and I write about that in the book. And that relative was Nigerian, and my DNA test result said I was about, 50% Nigerian, if we're going to put a percentage on it. But it's likely that I have Nigerian heritage, but it's definitely something I want to explore in the future. But I don't have any access or any tools to do that at the minute. So I keep my DNA on these files, on these systems somewhere, and hope that one day, I get a closer relative, because it's definitely something I'd want to pursue. But I had such a great relationship with my dad, who raised me, so that was something I battled with for a while. But I think if I did find out any more information, I would just welcome it at this stage. And then the relationship with my mum, I write a lot about that in the book, and we've spent many years in therapy together, and that's really, really helped us. And my brother as well, like he's definitely been a linchpin in our family since my dad passed away. So we've definitely become closer as a result of me talking about these things and writing about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. You definitely do go into that in the whole process in your book. So again, highly recommend everyone read it. We have another question. Someone asked if you could talk about your experiences in South Africa and Morocco.
Yeah, so I didn't write too much about South Africa in the book, but it was a really interesting place. But I went at a stage in which, there was a lot going on in my head with regards to my identity. And I went on a press trip again, and it was, everybody else on the press trip was white, and then there's me, and I remember kind of getting questioned all the time, like, how do you know all these people, like by the other South Africans, because it's still really racially divided. And I felt a little bit under the microscope with traveling through that country in an all white group, because it's just not something you see all the time, I realized. And people kind of couldn't believe that somebody like me was able to travel freely with all these white people, and that we were all kind of getting along, and it was a nice experience. And I kept telling people that this was a work trip, and it was an interesting one because it was a really beautiful country and I met some really great people, but I could sort of feel a lot of racial tension everywhere. And yeah, I definitely would love to go back and sort of do sort of more stuff with people from kind of communities that I want to get involved in creative communities. I definitely love to go back, but it was a beautiful country, like I loved it. And Morocco, that was the last stop on my trip, and I really, really liked that. Again, quite full on. I remember traveling with a group of people there, and sort of being shouted at and being told, hey, Beyonce, hey, like Shakira. They would just shout like any kind of ethnic celebrity at me, and it was a lot at times. So I enjoyed my time in Morocco. I'm not in a rush to go back, but definitely South Africa is on my list. I would adore another trip there at some point, or getting involved with creative communities there. I would love to do that.
Thank you for those answers. We have a question that's actually for Jess. If you're comfortable, if you could share a bit about your relationship with race and identity, and perhaps actually identify which parts of Georgina's story resonated most for you.
All of it. No, basically, so I grew up in the southwest in the countryside, and I had contact with my dad, who's Jamaican and Irish mixed. But I grew up in a predominantly white family where race was never discussed ever. Even now, it's not acknowledged at all. Um, and then, yeah, I used to refer to myself as being half caste. I thought that was the correct term to use. And then I went to London, and I kind of, all of my choices in life up till then, like all the music I was into was like really like punky, like but white punk, and like and nothing like rap. I would never go near anything like that at all. And then I got to London, and just was encouraged by seeing other mixed race people and black people around me. And Georgina mentions this amazing person called Charlie Brinkus Cuff, who started as one of the founders kind of Geldem, and I met her, and she really encouraged me to like start writing about race. So yeah, there's a lot of parallels of coming from a white background and trying to slowly acceptance, I think, of my racial identity, which is a continuous journey. Yeah, hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
No worries.
I'm curious for you, Georgina. I know this is like just now the release of the book, but so far in the feedback you've heard, how has it felt to hear people's responses to the book, or the feeling of people resonating with things that are so personal to your own experience?
Yeah, it's been amazing, because it's definitely helped me situate my story in a wider context and made me feel less alone, less alienated with aspects of my identity that were really hard to describe. Like telling people now, oh, I'm Nigerian, but I don't really know anything about it, or growing up and telling people that I had two white parents, but I didn't know why. And the effect that had on me was really hard to talk about. So hearing other people's stories and seeing my experiences mirrored in their life stories has been amazing. And it's really spurred me on, and like made me feel like I'm part of a community within this experience of being Black. There's this kind of like little growing community of people talking about transracial issues or misattributed identity and DNA testing, but there wasn't a lot of that when I first started writing. So it's been really nice to kind of spearhead that and open up these conversations. And yeah, it's been really cathartic, like Jess was saying. And I love getting feedback from people, and I love hearing how the books touch them. So yeah, I don't think that will ever get old. Like, keep all the compliments coming. Like, it's really nice to get the emails and all the praise and all that. Like, it really spurs me on. So especially because writing is such a solitary endeavor. So you're writing and you don't know if anyone's going to like it, and you're writing in your room and you don't know if it's any good. So once it's out there, it's really overwhelming to get such a great response. But it's fantastic as well, and it definitely encourages me to keep going.
I think also, Georgina, the thing that's so important, like it's getting better, but to have more British writers like representing like the nuances of race as well, like it's super important. And the fact that like it's not London centric, you're not London centric, and it kind of spreads around to like show that like people, like we do exist outside of the classic metropolitan centers,
Yeah, exactly. And I think as much as I look to African American identity, and I can be grateful for my time I spent in New York, there is definitely an overrepresentation of African American experiences within the diasporic conversations that we're having. So it's fantastic to connect with other people within the diaspora from the States, but also beyond. And I think it's really important that we're not just London centric, or we're not just US centric, and that we do start to have a bit of compassion and empathy for other people's experiences around the world, other people that look like us but don't have the same cultural identity as we do. All of these conversations definitely help us understand each other a little bit more.
Absolutely. And we have one other question from Jared, who's talking about their own experience, both in a biracial family, but also the idea of adopting both a biracial child and kind of the idea of transracial adoption. So I'm wondering if you could speak to any guidance you have, perhaps families trying to navigate questions on race and identity when adopting a child of a different ethnicity, or just any resources that you may have come across in your own journey that you'd like to share.
Yeah, well, I always say to people, like, I'm, you know, a mother to a small greyhound, but I don't have kids, so I'm loath to give like actual parenting advice because plants die in my care all the time. So that's just a little disclaimer. But I read a really great paper called Being Raised by White People, and that was written, can't remember who it was written by, but if you Google it, it will come up, and it was talking about, you know, the experiences of adoptees and children of color who have been raised by white people. And I reference it in the book. I can't remember the name of the authors who wrote it, but Being Raised by White People, that was a really great study into, yeah, what it's like to be a transracial adoptee. And it collates loads of people's experiences together and talks about that sort of feeling of dislocation. And I think that could be really a great reference point. It's like a sociology paper. And then like guidance from me, I guess. Yeah, I don't believe that a transracial upbringing has to be traumatic, or it has to be, you know, shrouded in silence and awkwardness. Like, the answer is just to have open dialogues and teach your kids to be proud of their heritage and to show them that there's a lot of beauty and complexity in looking the way that they do. And I think just giving them constant reminders about who they are, and, you know, giving them resources from whatever background they represent, taking them to places where they can see other people who look like them. That's been really important for me as I've traveled. And yeah, I think all of that would definitely help shape them as a child. But again, I'm not a parent, so I'm loath to give parenting advice. But if I was having kids now and they were of a different background to me, that's what I would do. I would also let them know that, you know, the world can be unfair and racially hierarchical, and, you know, that's the reality of their experience. But obviously, as a parent, you're going to be there for them, and you're going to defend them, and you're going to back them up. But you need to, I think, prepare them for that as well, because, yeah, that's something I really had to kind of learn on my own. So it would have been great to have those conversations when I was a kid.
Thank you. I think that's excellent advice. For people of all ages throughout the learning process about identity. So with that, I want to thank you both for such an engaging and interesting conversation. I've seen so many comments in the chat of people just how this has affirmed their own experience, or that they've learned something new. So I want to thank you both. And I also want to thank our partner Litquake for co-presenting this program. And I encourage everyone to check out the future programs from both of our organizations at litquake.org and moadsf.org. We have information in the chat about purchasing a copy of RACELESS from the MoAD bookstore. So I encourage everyone to do so and to read the full story. We also love to hear feedback from our audiences. So if you're able to just take a few moments to fill out our program survey, we do appreciate that. It always helps us know how to best serve our communities. And we also do appreciate any financial support. If you are able to donate to the museum, you can either visit our website, MoAD SF, or text the number 56512 and type MoAD SF. And that's another easy way to give a donation. So we really appreciate everyone for attending today and being engaged in both of our presenters. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.